Yes, Sarthak, you are audible.
Thanks. So apologies for the initial glitches. Good evening, everyone. I'm Sarthak, and on behalf of Kutch International, I welcome you all to what might be the new normal of conducting such interactions and events in the near future. Just before we begin, I'd just like to give a couple of quick house announcements. Firstly, it is a request to everyone to please keep their microphones on mute while the session is in progress in order to avoid any confusion or commotion. Secondly, if you wish to make any interventions or ask any questions in between, kindly message them through the Zoom group chat, specifically to either the host by the ID cut Zoom or Mr. Uday Mehta, and we will then take it up in the due course of the discussions. Also, please do mention the specific speakers to which your questions are supposed to be directed. And just a quick shout out, this webinar will also be live streamed on Kut's YouTube channel as well as the Facebook live handle and Twitter live handle of Mr. Suresh Prabhu. So please share that amongst your networks. We'll share the link as soon as we do it. And now, without further ado, I'd like to invite Mr. Uday Mehta for the welcome and introductory remarks. Over to you, Uday.
Thank you, Sarthak. Thank you very much. On behalf of Kutch, I would like to welcome the chair, all the speakers and participants for today's webinar. We're extremely grateful for you to take out your time for this important session. It is indeed a changing paradigm for the Indian power sector that I'm sure all of us are witnessing, who have been working in the sector for more than a decade now. Even in the run-up to this webinar, several announcements and changes have been proposed to the way this sector is being and is going to be governed in the near future. Firstly, the draft amendment bill was rolled out for comments, on which we'll have a detailed discussion in this webinar. Then, interestingly, came the government's announcement of the enormous stimulus package, perhaps in order of 10% of the GDP. In the first phase, it announced rupees 90,000 crores, which were aimed at discoms. And most recently came the new draft tariff policy, doing away with the 50 to 60 odd consumer categories by introducing voltage-based tariff with no price differentiation for the consumers. The timing and frequency of such reforms raises a pertinent question. Are we headed in the right direction? This webinar by Kutch International is an attempt to inform this discourse only, and we thought we will address the concerns by looking at these amendments from the perspective of the consumer's viewpoint. As all of you know, Kutch, as a consumer representative, has been working in this sector for more than 2 decades, looking at the power sector reforms from a consumer lens. Amendments such as allowing open access, consumers to enter into direct contracts, removing cross subsidies, which have a significant impact on the way different types of consumers perceive these developments. To this effect, we also wrote an article which was published in the Economic Times, where we have discussed the gaps of intent and implementation between what the amendments have been proposed and what the statement of objects and reasons specify. Once again, the key question remains whether the amendments are sufficient enough to tackle the long persistent structural challenges, while also assessing how different consumers, who are not mere stakeholders, but are shareholders in the governance of this sector, are going to be impacted. We strongly advocate for the need to undertake cost-benefit assessment of the proposed amendments before its implementation in a half-baked manner. The line of speaker does reflect our commitment to our motto of putting the consumer first, and we hope that this session is mutually enriching for everyone attending this. Thank you to all of you once again, and look forward to a fruitful discussion. Mr. Prabhu, I hope you can hear us now.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for joining us on behalf of Kutch. Uday Mehta, welcome you to the session. And I'll hand over to Dr. Gauri, who's chair of the session, to take the proceedings forward. Thank you, Dr. Gauri.
Namaskar, Mr. Prabhu.
Thank you.
And I do remember in my younger days, your enthusiasm in reforming the power sector, and had the chance of interacting with you at Administrative Staff College of India. Having stated that, since you have so little time, but you're someone who's been interested in trying to make this a much more viable sector, I think all of us today in this webinar would really like you to respond to the fact that there's been a lot of centralization that has taken place under the Act. And yet, at the same time, there have been a lot of efforts to make things much more efficient, like trying to get rid of subsidy, to try to look at who a consumer is. So I'd like to ask, and you can start off the discussion, is that if there is so much centralization and the state commission's role get much reduced, and the states are the ones who know the consumers, how do you look at it? Who is the consumer that one addresses this entire reforms? And secondly, how would you proceed further in making this a very viable sector?
Firstly, thank you very much. And I'm honored by the fact that none other than you are chairing such a great session, with your such a great credentials, including working in Competition Commission and many other sectors. You have made it always something which is worth of emulation. So thank you very much for doing this. Thank Cuts for organizing this program. Very briefly, if you permit me. When we are drafting electricity bill, that time it was a bill, not an act yet, we had a widest consultation possible. And one of the key messages that we're getting from the consultation was that sometimes it is difficult for the states to take certain unpleasant decisions, particularly when it comes to raising tariffs. It finds very difficult for them to take it politically. So sometimes it is that the message was that why not you take the responsibility as the federal government, central government, and try to do that unpleasant thing, and so that we can actually say, put it on the burden of the central government. In electricity, consumer is the responsibility of the state, no doubt about it, because the state electricity boards then and now the DISCOMs are the ones who supply electricity to the consumer. But still, that consumer is a citizen of India, also the responsibility of the federal government. Also, the power sector, which is linked to one another. We have state grids, but we have also national grid, which again, when I was in power minister way back in 2002, we had initiated that project, which is now completed. So in a way, a consumer is related and connected to the national grid. Sometimes if you have deficit power in your state, you draw it from the other states. Why? Because there is a national grid which facilitates it. So therefore, a consumer is a responsibility of the central government as much as it is a direct responsibility of the state government. So we must therefore find out a way of how do you handle this very difficult situation in which the state DISCOMs are in trouble. The electricity is going to be one of the most important components for Make in India campaign that we want to make it successful under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi. So therefore, the regulatory commissions will play a very key role. And the regulatory commissions, the way they're appointed and their accountability to the bosses who appoint them, makes it very difficult for them to sometimes take these unpleasant decisions. I will recall when we were creating this forum of regulators and addressed them, I used to tell them that one of the major responsibility for you is not just to increase tariff alone, but also to make power sector commercially viable. And the viability of the sector will come only when the cost plus tariff are put into this. The cost plus was a different phenomena at that time. And when we are bringing Electricity Act, the cost plus phenomena was that you incur whatever cost and then the government will add a little more and you will be able to fix the tariff for it. Now it is not a situation like this. It is a competitive mechanism. Though the competition has not fully come into play because the common access has not become reality, which I tried to do it partially. After becoming railway minister, I introduced the concept of common access, surpassing sometimes the state government's owned DISCOMs. But once you have to make power sector commercially viable, that means one, we'll have to get in competition to protect the consumer. At the same time, we'll have to make sure that the generators as well as the distribution companies are properly taken care of on commercial consideration. Today, if you are putting tariffs and then you are giving concession. In fact, I will tell you, Electricity Act had a provision which was amended subsequently. The 2003 Act had a provision that to remove cross subsidization. But then subsequently we removed it. So now what you are asking me is so-called centralization may be a good idea for the state themselves. It is a what are we centralizing? We are only centralizing certain principles on which a central body will now preside over the tariff fixation and other measures. Also, we are bringing in an element of direct benefit transfer for those who need to be given subsidy. That's the right method. And that is what exactly was said, that the tariff should be fixed on commercial consideration. Thereafter, if the state government wants to feel that somebody needs to be given some concession, some benefit, like farmers, for example, good logic, give it directly to them. And now there's a technology available. So I fully feel that the spirit of this amendment is right. We must put into place. The state governments will again have a say into this matter. They're not that they're just completely disregarded. But I would feel states will be most benefited when the power system will become commercially viable, when there will be more power available to the consumer. States will be benefiting from it because the consumer will feel that states are responsible also to give us assured power. I had a consultation with farmers organization, almost all at that time, when they should tell me, don't give us free power because that's only an assurance which never happens. Give us assured power at a reasonable rate. That is very important, reasonable rate. Now that will happen. If the states feel that some farmer need to be given concessional rate or subsidy or whatever rate subsidy, they can be given direct benefit transfer. So there is a problem. So I think this is a good method.
Can I just ask two more questions? One, yeah. You're saying is a very positive response. And I agree with you in the question of the subsidy and the fact that the commission would send the reforms up to the government and the government will say increase the prosody, reduce the subsidy and the whole exercise. But on what basis are you going to decide cost? Because I think it is also important that it should be a cost-based tariff, but one must take into account what I would call as the consumer's contribution to the peak load, the coincident demand. So has cost been decided? Because this cost plus doesn't work, we agree with that. Related to that, I think what is very interesting is bringing this enforcement authority, contracts enforcement authority, because now you've made the electricity sector into a kind of nexus of contracts. So suppose I as a consumer want to take power from a solar, then I will draw a contract with the solar company and also with the transmission company. So your views on that, sir?
See, number one, the cost, very important issue. What is cost? That is very important. Is it historical or is it come out with some competitive element brought into it so that we exactly know what it is? I will remind you again, when we are making Electricity Act, we are delicensed generation with a very deliberate purpose that it should bring in element of competition at a level of generation. Why ministry should sit down judgment about deciding this cost and finding out in it, and then all kinds of wrongdoings will happen as a result of that. So we said we'll de-license it. So today, the cost can be ascertained based on market forces, really speaking, and that would be bringing in element of competition into it. So that if you have a tariff-based bidding to award a contract, and even otherwise, when there is a de-licensed generation, virtually anybody can start the power plant if he wants to do it. And as a result of that, when you want to supply electricity, there should be a competitive element so that the bidding should happen at that level. So automatically that cost element can be taken care of if you introduce this kind of element of competitive spirit through a completely transparent measure. See, the success of all this will depend upon key element, that's transparency. If the transparency is there, visible for people to, and they feel it. It's not just in word, but they feel that there is a transparent operation. I think that will not have any problem. In any case, that element of cost is very important. Other point, which probably you had in your mind when you asked me this question, was cost also at a DISCOM level involves inefficiency. It involves transmission and distribution losses, which are beyond what is technically feasible or desirable. So that also should not be loaded on cost per se. It should be decided on the basis of efficient operation. I think those parameters, again, will have to be fixed very properly to ensure that inefficiency or any wrongdoing does not get loaded on the cost which will be finally borne by the consumer. So that is a very fair point, has to be done, and that should be the spirit, in my opinion, and that should be put into place. The second element, which you asked me about the enforcement of contract. See, actually speaking, we had a very difficult time earlier years when the first major challenge came to efficacy and the sanctity of contracts. When, if you recall, Enron happened. The Enron invoked this clause saying that in India there is no contract. But of course we challenge it. We put it into this. I will not get into it, but how that was a difficult time when I was a Minister of Power when this happened. But we met with that challenge very effectively and we somehow ward it off. But now there is no question of contract per se has to have a validity, must have a sanctity. So that point is very well, not just power sector, any contract. What is when you enter into a contract, of course, now if you find there was a fraud in a contract, if you find there was something completely wrong statement, misrepresentation, all of that, that's a different matter. But otherwise, there is the Indian Contract Act, which is as old, much beyond, maybe more than 100 years old now. So what is a contract? It is what agreed between you and me as two parties to the contract. And if you just completely, for no rhyme or reason, no justifiable reason, you try to walk out of it, then there cannot be any business that can be transacted. So sanctity of contract has to be honored. Point is, whether a contract should be enforced only irrespective of when you find that there was something patently wrong. It's a completely different issue. Otherwise, sanctity has to be maintained. And that is not just for this, for any infrastructure project. See, India needs to put maybe 10% of India's GDP into infrastructure. And that would run into several $100 billion because our GDP is now close to $3 trillion. Maybe $400 billion of money we want to invest into infrastructure. When the government doesn't have money, obviously we'll rely on private sector to come in and invest that money. If there is no sanctity of contract, who will put the money, you tell me? Even forget private sector. Even government companies will not put that money because there will not be any bankability. If there is the banks will not lend money. Private equity will not come in. So how do you actually build infrastructure for India if there is no sanctity for contract?
I'm so glad because we've had a lot of cases in the commission, competition commission on contracts. Now, I would like you, sir, if you spare a few minutes, there must be one or two questions people would like to ask.
Please.
So I leave it to the host to choose a question and put it forward.
Please.
Thank you, Dr. Gauri. Good afternoon, sir. So one question for you. I'll just take that. Based on what you have said, why is there resistance from states for centralization? If what you say is correct, then the state should be welcoming the amendment, but they are not. Your views, sir.
See, actually, I explained to you the historical background. I'll give a little more historical background to this. You know, when the NTPC was set up, or National Hydroelectric Power Corporation was set up, there was also a resistance because till that time, there is a historically 1948, we nationalized all the electricity business. And then we created integrated monopolies for transmission and distribution generation under state electricity boards, for all the states. So therefore, central government had no role to play, really speaking. But we realized much later, I think Mr. K.C. Pant used to be the Minister of Power at that time, that we realized that we had to generate more electricity to feed it into the grid to help the states. So that intervention from the central government was, again, there was some reservation. But that helped because when in 2002, when we were actually planning this electricity act, almost 1/3 of the electricity into the grid was going from NTPC alone. So just imagine if there are no intervention from the central government much earlier and there was no NTPC, what would happen to the power sector? That was on the generation front. So and that particular time, again, I will tell you something very interesting. We made tripartite agreement with central government, state government, and the central and Reserve Bank of India, signing agreement that if there is a default on the part of a state government to pay to the central utility, will invoke the provision of central devolution, money will be deducted so that power utilities and others can be paid off. When we are signing that, a huge opposition from the state government, huge. But as a result of that, when we signed it, we never invoked it. We didn't have to use a central devolution. In fact, it happened during my time as a power minister. We did many things, so among this one, another thing. But as a result of that, the discipline came in. A lot of states started recovering money from the consumer to pay to the state electricity board. So state electricity board itself honor the commitment to the central utility. NTPC rate had gone down, recovery rate had gone down below 50%. And therefore, I used to jocularly say that NTPC will one day become NTC, National Textile Corporation. If the same situation had gone. So central intervention will always be seen with some reservation. But as history has proved, that such intervention has helped the states more. So I feel the states should be welcoming it. There is no centralization per se. It is actually taking the burden away from the state into the hands of the central government, which in turn can help the states to generate more electricity, make electricity sector commercially viable, make their own discoms viable, which will reduce the burden for the state government to give any budgetary support. So is it good for the state or bad for the state? So if I am doing something for my child, taking away from one school and putting him into a better school and putting him into the boarding school maybe, my child will feel, see, I was very happy coming home every day, but now putting him in the boarding school is taking care of his future better. So that is how the central government intervention should be looked at.
Thank you, sir. I think your optimism is something we're looking forward. Thank you so much for joining the webinar. And now I will, if you have time, join us. Otherwise, we hope that...
Right.
Next, I request Mr. Girish Pradhan, who's also been a commission member, he was the chairman of CERC, to take up the entire issue again on contract enforcement. Because you see, the CERC also has a role of national tariff.
Let me
You can
take
maybe
your
do it in the
permission to
end.
leave because I have to attend another program. But let me say one word about, or a few words about Girish Pradhan. He is one of the most eminently suited, not to talk about this, but he did a great job as a CERC chairman. So I think he will also share his perspective about it. I can tell you something, that all of us must support the good amendments, which will in turn will make power sector better. And this is like Electricity Act 2003. I had a big challenge when I was introducing it. I had to talk to all the trade union leaders who had said that
अभी तो सुरेश को
give you a very good
stop
perspective.
we can
Permit me to leave. Thank you very much.
नहीं वो एक सेकंड के लिए म्यूट नहीं था मैंने कर दिया म्यूट सर
Mr. Girish Pradhan. Is Mr. Girish Pradhan there?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I think
Good evening, ma'am.
you.
Oh, how are you? I was listening to both your... Hello?
Hello.
yes sir you're audible
Yeah. I was listening very avidly to what you said and what Mr. Prabhu, the former minister and somebody I know very well said. So, of course, there's no doubt that we do look upon these draft amendments with some degree of optimism. However, we can't really let our optimism override certain basic facts and certain ground realities which, ma'am, we need, and you know very well, need to take into full consideration. There's an oft-repeated saying that the way to purgatory is paved with good intentions. The entire draft amendment is very good intentions. I mean, there is things which I would really say, things like cost-reflective tariff, the subsidies being directly given, and the tariffs being set on reflection of costs. Various other things like putting cross-border trade of electricity squarely with the Central Regulatory Commission, and a number of things, which are there. But let's just look at three issues that I have, and where I do feel that perhaps we need to sit back and have a relook at it. One is this new EPCA that is sought to be, created. I mean, I always say that in the energy sector, the only regulated portion of the entire gamut of energy is the electricity sector. We don't have a regulator for the inputs, for the fuel. We don't have regulators anywhere else. So the regulatory mechanism in the power sector, thanks to the Electricity Act of 2003, is now settled. And it is, I mean, people may criticize it or people may find faults with it, but it's a structure that is now there. Plus, it does adjudicate on a number of issues. You are now planning to create another entity and carving out a particular portion of the total canvas of the regulatory commissions and giving it to them without realizing the fact that that kind of adjudication will have impacts on tariff also. Besides, where is the necessity for another structure when you have the state regulatory commissions and the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission? The idea would have been to strengthen them. And I'm glad there is a provision to give a fourth member to the state electricity regulatory commissions who would be from the legal side, which would again take away from one of the criticisms that had gone up to the Honorable Supreme Court, that the regulatory commissions didn't have a legal person. So you are going to have now a setup in the state regulatory commissions which can easily handle this. So you don't need to put up this huge entity, which is, with my experience, I can tell you, is going to lead to a lot of ambiguity and as well as forum shopping in terms of where the parties are going to go. Besides, the number of contracts which are there at the state level in terms of open access, net metering, etc., are huge. And these are all going to now shift to this EPCA. It doesn't make, to my limited knowledge, make much sense. So I would rather request the powers that be, back, strengthen your state regulatory commissions and allow this work to be carried out through them. The other thing, sorry, you were about to say, no, I was only mentioning the subsidy part. It's a very good thing to have direct transfer subsidy. The only thing is ground reality doesn't make me very confident about the fact that we'll be able to roll this out in terms of direct transfer. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with the subsidy being given to the distribution, the DISCOM. So which is the situation as it stands today? The subsidy by the government is given to the DISCOM. The only thing you are doing is you're telling the regulator, do not take into consideration any subsidy, commitment to subsidy, but fix the tariff on the basis of cost, appropriate costs, of course, taking your point as to the various costs that are involved. Now, whether the subsidy, we are back to square one where the government, if it doesn't deliver the subsidies, DISCOM falls further into the abyss, and the direct transfer is going to take a long, long time. It's really not that simple. Many of the major states do not have meters on the agriculture side.
So, Mr. Pradhan,
yeah,
we are really getting back into a situation where one is trying very hard with this sector, but as you have been chairman of CERC, and I worked with an APERC, I know how difficult it is. And therefore, thank you so much. Although we have so many contracts, perhaps when there are a lot of so many contracts, rather than a new organization, the Competition Commission will also come in because it's on competitive markets. We've had cases earlier on. I would like a slightly different viewpoint now that the CERC has spoken from a private sector participant, from the group Shantanu from Prayas, who have been very active members and have done detailed work on this. And his idea is to look at what this act would do. I know he has put up a new note today. I read it, but I will ask him to speak about it on the subsidy. Is it subsidy agnostic or is it consumer agnostic? Is a view that I would like Shantanu to take it up and to develop further on the aspect of tariffs.
Thank you, Dr. Gauri. I hope I am audible, and it's a pleasure to be here and be part of this gathering and share some viewpoints. Before getting into the issue of subsidy, I would just like to make a brief observation or comment, I would say, on the entire amendments that have been put up for public consultation. I think, yes, nobody would doubt that there is a need to make certain changes, certain amendments into the Act. Last major amendments was more than a decade ago. So in the last 10 years, so many things have changed. So the Act needs to be amended, no doubt about it. But unfortunately, what we find is these amendments are really trying to fix certain specific issues in a very piecemeal manner. Rather, what we would expect as a consumer organization or as a civil society organization is a much more comprehensive view in terms of what are the problems that are being addressed, how these amendments are forward looking, because there are so many changes, technological changes, economic structures are changing. So how these amendments are trying to address those changes, that also would have been important to look at. So just a brief comment on that is a better articulation about the vision for the sector, what it should be within next say a decade or so, and then based on that proposing certain amendments would have been far more desirable or required in a way, I would say. Coming to the issue of subsidy, yes, subsidy is a very important issue. It's a vexed issue that all of us have been trying to deal with for the last at least 3 to 4 decades. You go back to any report in the power sector, and the first and foremost issue that they will be discussing about is the issue of subsidy. But I think in the last 5-7 years, the whole discussion about subsidy and the need for subsidy has undergone a lot of change, and that needs to be reflected into the Act. For example, the subsidy has 2 components. So one is cross subsidy that industrial and commercial consumers would provide, and second is the direct subsidy that governments are giving. Now, if you look at the issue of cross subsidy is definitely likely to go away in coming years. And the simple reason for that is the way cost of renewable energy, which is so modular, which is so easy to install, has a very short gestation time, is coming down. Many large commercial and industrial consumers or even large residential consumers are finding it very, very attractive to deploy their own solar plants, whether it is in the form of rooftop or group captive or variety of other ways to actually ensure migration away from the distribution company, not in terms of completely going away in terms of degrading, but definitely reducing their dependence on DISCOMs. So the whole potential for cross subsidy is going down, and that needs to be recognized and addressed. But the second component, that the state subsidy will be here and will need to stay, especially for certain class of consumers like agriculture, which definitely deserve subsidy compared to the current cost of electricity. And that brings us to that issue that the state governments will have to take larger responsibility of providing subsidy to these deserving consumers. Now, how much is that subsidy? That itself we need to see, as Dr. Gauri and Dr. Prabhu also pointed out. We need to find what is efficient cost of supply. The cost of inefficiency, whether it is excess T&D losses, whether it is inappropriate and inefficiently planned power purchase procurement and cost arising out of that, that should not get counted as cost of supply and hence increasing the subsidy burden for consumers. Second issue is we also need to be very frugal in terms of deciding actually which are the consumer categories which should deserve subsidy and what is the scale of subsidy that they deserve. For example, saying that consumers, even they are consuming 200 units per month or 300 units per month, deserve a significant subsidy. In my opinion, many states are not in a financial position to afford that. So one has to be very, very careful in terms of deciding this. Now, coming to the third issue, and which the Act tries to bring out, is emphasizing direct benefit transfer. Theoretically, yes, this is will potentially help in terms of better subsidy targeting and management. But we need to consider some ground reality. First of all is we don't have good enough administrative systems which will actually enable a proper disbursement of this direct benefit transfer subsidy mechanism. A simple example is even meter connections are many times on father's name, grandfather's name, but the grandchildren or their some relatives are actually beneficiary of that land and they are using and tilling that land. So from there we will have to actually do the entire administrative exercise to sort out these records to be able to actually identify who are the beneficiaries of that, which are their whether those are properly linked to the bank accounts or no. We'll have to deal with, in case of urban issues, urban consumers, deal with issues such as tenants, whether the subsidy should go to tenant or the landlord, because connection is most typically in the name of landlord. So these are the kind of practical difficulties that one will have to address. And last point on this DBT, which in my opinion is the most crucial point that we need to remember, is whether states are in a position to pay this DBT amount in a timely manner. And if not, then what happens? I just want to give you one example, which is a very recent number that I learned, and I was really shocked to learn about those numbers. In case of state of Punjab, the total power procurement cost is about 22,000 crores, whereas the subsidy due by the state government is about 16,000 crores. So out of 22,000 crores of annual power procurement cost, accumulated subsidy due by the state government is to the tune of 16,000 crores. So one can imagine, if there are so much delays and state governments are not able to pay committed subsidy on time, then what will be the impact of DBT? Whether consumers will be required to pay full tariff because they are not getting DBT on time, whether poor consumers, especially let's say farmers, have the ability to pay their full cost of electricity and then wait for 6 months or 8 months for the state government to pay through the DBT mechanism. So we'll have to keep these practical challenges also in mind before really jumping into and really expecting that DBT kind of solutions will be the sort of magic wand to solve all subsidy related problems. Sorry for having a little longer answer, but I think I just wanted to bring those issues for the consideration of the audience.
Yeah, and we also look forward to your protocol, which you have now put up, which is a good thing. But before I ask Ashok Pense, who is with MERC, I think you're still with MERC.
Yeah.
Because now we have to go back from the state, from the center to the state.
Yeah.
You see, the new paradigm that's come up, and decentralization is the paradigm. So
Yeah.
we're going into centralization, and we're going into decentralization, and we also have a very famous case, your Tata versus Reliance, with someone take electricity from one and the other, and Section 42 coming in.
Yeah.
So responses to this act and the new paradigm that has come up, and whether we can enable consumers to have more choice.
See, at that moment of time, probably Maharashtra is blessed with two things. One is, we have got we have got MSTDCL, which is a state utility, versus in respect of Bombay, we have got two private utilities, namely Tata's and Reliance, now called as Adani, and BSC, the Bombay Municipal Corporation. Now, if you look at private versus state utility comparison, and that's what probably we would like to do in the light of should the state be there, for the competition, should the private utilities should be brought in. Now, if you look at Reliance and Tata, actually the Reliance original license was Killick-Nixon, then came to BSES, then came to Reliance, now it is Adani. But these licenses were granted in 1906, 1908, and the Reliance license was in 1923. So other way around of it is, the Bombay utilities, there is nothing like they were privatized now. They are in existence for last 120 years, as against the states, which is only for 60 years. So Bombay is not really speaking called as such as privatization, because it was there for 120 years. So how can you call it privatization today? This is the first part. Now, having said that, if I want to compare, let's say, state versus the private utilities, there are three, four, let's take some positives and then let's try to go to the negative parts also. Now, as far as the positive parts of our concern, one thing is definitely there. If you look at Bombay supply, for almost 120 years, 24 by 365 supply is there. Nobody in Bombay talks about generator, diesel generator, inverters, nothing of that sort we talk about, because we just don't know what the power is not there. So that being the thing, as far as the Mumbai utilities are concerned, in case of the state, the number, including the cities like my colleague Mr. Shantanu stays Pune, let's say one of the most modern cities. Now, even over there, we have no power. This sort of complaint exists, and no power complaints are plenty, which to the tune of maybe 60-65% of the total complaints from the existing consumers are pretty large. That sort of complaints in Mumbai are virtually zero. This is one part. Now let us look at the second part. Now, which is very remarkable. See, Mumbai does not have interruptions at all. And that goes to the three basic equipment. One is the type of equipment these parties have been purchasing is reasonably of good quality. I'll come to the rest and the next part of the financial part of it. So reasonably good quality, and I feel that there is not a rampant corruption as far as the equipment is concerned. So we have got a good equipment. There is a second part. Whether we like it or not, one thing is definitely there, that the quality or efficiency of these employees is better than from the state discom. I'm not trying to say all 100%, but majority of it. But there is one more thing which is definitely missing, and that the missing part is the Bombay people have got, the employees have got a pride in trying to complete their, attending to the interruption in the shortest possible time, so that the Bombay supply is continuously on. Over there, that sort of pride itself doesn't exist. So if I don't do it, it's okay. What can I do? This sort of thing exists to a large extent. Typically, I'll give my own example because I'm taking little more longer time to this. My own house house from a village which is about 150 kilometers called Jawar. In my village, there was the transformer failed. The moment the transformer failed, for 2 days, the villagers didn't told me. On a second, third day said, sir, why don't you have a look? I talked to the concerned junior engineer or something. He said, sir, we are doing it. Third day went. Then I talked to superintending engineer on the fourth day. Even then it didn't happen. Ultimately, after 5 or 6 days, I talked to, since I knew, I talked to the MD. He said, even for you, you're not getting a supply. I said, yes, sir. And then that superintending engineer got very much bugged with me because I spoke to MD and he had a big firing. I said, what is the problem? He said, sir, we don't have 100 kVA transformer. I said, fair enough. Put 63 kVA. He said, is it okay? I said, we will tell everybody to curtail the load. And 63 kVA, but अंधेरे बैठने के बदले में थोड़ा तो उजाला आ जाएगा, चलो वो भी करेंगे. So he said, okay, and it was done in 2 hours. But why we have to do, to go for, instead of 100, restore the supply, even with a little lesser load, why do we have to go to, a common man has to go to a MD? This sort of pride is grossly missing, which exists even with BEST, which is a Bombay Municipal Corporation employees. Not only that, if you make a complaint and once they restore, they make a phone call to you and ask you, sir, you had made a call. Is it restored? Then we have to say, sir, yes, thank you very much. You are restored it in 35 minutes. So this is the basic difference. Having said that, are they really, what should I say, are we really in the heaven? Unfortunately, no. One, there are few things which are very common to all of them. One part of it is, basically the private utilities, they do not want to go for a competitive bidding as far as the purchase of power is concerned. They want to create their own generation, go to section 62 and buy, whether it was Reliance, whether it was Tata. So we have not been in a position to make any change in that. This is the first part. Obviously the price shoots up, one part. Second part of it, the major money comes via return on equity. So what they are trying to do basically is put more and more money into buying the equipment, strengthen the distribution network, But the crux of the issue is return on equity is going up at a phenomenally high rate. This is the second part of it. Third part of it is, let's take a specific case of putting smart meters. We have invested 1,000 crores. Well, they might have got some advantage. But the crux of the issue is, have we reduced our power purchase cost by talking to the consumer? And because, it has a two-way communication port. So we have done it. The answer is no. So the crux of the issue is, Bombay has the highest rate as far as the power is concerned. So though on one side we are good, as far as the tariff side is concerned, we are really suffering. This is the difference between DISCOMs and the private utilities. Take over, madam.
Yes, I think you have made the point very well. But there's also something I must remind you, that while you can put Bombay as a very good example, and you have treated the question of agricultural metering on the DISCOMs and Pune side, you have problems in some of your other regions also. So, well, I suppose every state has its own share of problems.
Yes.
And I'm glad you have brought out these points, because I think we now take up the aspect of the tricky consumer. Pune, you had that problem with the question of how do you provide agricultural supply to consumers and get the farmers to have their own metering on the transformers itself. But for this, I will request, I'm sorry, I think because we are running out of time, I will have a separate chat with you, Ashok, on it. But I would now like Ajay to come on, because, small DISCOMs, it doesn't matter. But for a large number of DISCOMs, the consumer is who's supposed to be getting the subsidies, the farmer. But what is also worrying, which I used to find a lot of time, is that the farmer who gets the subsidies, is the point that I think was raised by Shantanu, is not necessarily the tiller to the soil. It is like the free power to landlords in small houses in Delhi, but the ones who stay in the houses pay at least 11 rupees per unit while he gets a free farm. So how do you make sure that of farmers, and how are they going to get their subsidy if it is entitled for them? And what is their position? Because if all said and done, it's a very major area of concern for the electricity sector itself. So Ajay, can you enlighten us on this? Ajay is not there?
Thank you for this. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
So thank you for this opportunity, and it's nice to be at a discussion where everyone seems to be blaming farmers, and maybe to some extent rightly so. But but I would want to first of all say that my views are my personal views, because I'm also heading a statutory body, Punjab State Farmers Commission, which advises the Punjab government on farmer issues. So I want to place that on record, because my views are and could be not the same as my state. So lots of time the industry is saying that there is a question of crop subsidization of power subsidy. Now, if you just look at the power utility DISCOM accounts, then it could be partly true, and it's also true that the cross subsidy in a state like Punjab is very high, and maybe in other states also it is high. So it's fair for industry to feel aggrieved about this, that why are farmers, or I think so the papers don't say why are the poor getting subsidized, or why are the farmers getting subsidized, and why is the burden being loaded onto the industry. So I think it's a valid point. But what we must understand is that everybody is getting a subsidy in some form or the other. The industry is getting a subsidy. The consumers are home delivery. Everyone's getting a subsidy. Everyone's paying a tax. And just as everyone pays different forms of tax, agriculture also gets taxed in
different ways. You've got cut off.
Mr. Jaffer, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Yes.
Can you get Ajay back?
Yes, I'm back.
Good.
Okay, yeah. I'm sorry for this. So, so I'm saying if you look at subsidies only for power sector, then obviously it appears that farmers are the culprits. But you have to take any picture in a holistic point of view. Farmers everywhere in the world, even in the United States, even in Europe, even in UK, everywhere in the world are subsidized. It is for the government to decide how they're going to subsidize something. And many governments, state governments have taken the view of subsidizing electricity by giving free electricity to farmers. So it's not an issue that should farmers be subsidized. It's an issue of how they need to be subsidized, and if electricity is the way to subsidize them, should they get unmetered power supply? My opinion is that they should not get unmetered free power supply, but they definitely need to be subsidized. So we need to rationalize the way the subsidy is being given, and that is the question. The question is not that do they need to be subsidized or not subsidized, but we need to find a way. And as a farmer, or as someone advising the Punjab government, my opinion is that electricity is secondary. It is the water which is the primary problem. That free electricity is leading to depleting aquifers and depleting underground water, which will have even far greater and graver consequences for this country. So I'll just leave it at that. If you have,
Ajay, I want to ask you two questions, because I think many of us have appreciated what Punjab has done in terms of giving an incentive that if you consume as per the meter, the difference of it you'll be given as an incentive, because the water is a major problem there. The second thing is, what do you think of DBT? Because it's not the question of subsidy. Is the subsidy going
can you repeat that?
Can you quickly answer that before I call the next person?
Yes. So you're asking about DBT. So I would say that, many people say that instead of subsidy or concessional tariffs for DBT, we've given a draft farmers policy to the state government where we've clearly stated that subsidy cannot, the way it is, transfer and give differential subsidy to farmers. In the sense, we've also told clearly that farmers owning more than 10 acres of land should not be subsidized the way some 1 or 2 acre farmer is being subsidized, because the state finances are in a problem. And so DBT is definitely required, but it needs to be designed in a way that it will make it less politically contentious and the deserving people get it. So we need apart from doing a DBT, we need an exclusion criteria.
I think, the problems are so complicated that the devil is in the details. So when we try to even do more finer tuning, let's go on to swing.
I have just one more. I have just one more point to make.
Sure, go ahead.
It out that Punjab, the fact figures were given of 22,000 crores and 16,000 crores. I don't think so. Those figures are correct, or maybe I'm outdated on these. But I would want to say that why has this problem arisen? The problem has arisen because the past government made agreements on tariff, which this government is standing on, which was so detrimental to the state. So can a central regulatory body have a way of making these tariffs when a particular political dispensation or a particular set of bureaucrats in league with the politicians, because it can't happen otherwise, they sign such contracts that will have perpetual damage to farmers, and then farmers get paid for it. You got to say what is wrong. If we keep saying farmers are wrong, it doesn't help. The genesis of the problem is the politicians and the bureaucrats running the state signed, because of which Punjab is suffering, and they will keep suffering into the future. And I think DBT is 100% required. But let's not run away from the real topic.
I agree with you, Ajay. And I think we should retain our union of states. The union of states is very important. Each state has its own set of problems, and even whether the others agree or not. But now in this setup, the last very interesting issue that has been coming up, and which I will now ask my good friend Ashwini to come on to it. Ashwini, on the question of renewable energy sources. The amendment brings in hydro as also part of the thing. And also the fact that now PXIL is giving power around the clock. What do you feel about two aspects about it? The question of now, since it can be traded, how would be the RPOB for the state commissions to set up? How much would the extent of renewable sources of energy should they take? Because does it make any sense? You You can get power from anywhere they want. And the second thing that comes up is, how do you look at it in the context of the larger figure that although we're gung-ho about a lot of solar and wind, we still have to be dependent on thermal. Ashwini?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Gauri. Am I audible?
Oh, yes, you are.
Yeah. Okay, so the Act basically makes three provisions around renewable energy, three broader provisions. So one of them is the National Renewable Energy Policy, and the other is hydro, which is now considered large hydro, which is now considered part of RE. So this proposal is to provide a separate minimum hydro purchase target. And the third is there's now proposal for higher penalties for non-compliance. So these are the three targets. So let me first tell what is my concern about this. So I think RE sector is quite near to maturity. So we have experimented with a range of technologies. We have tried a range of policy instruments, starting from feed-in tariff to viability gap fund and competitive reverse bidding also. So we have tried a range of things, and the country has a firm target, from middle-term target, from long-term target. So what is unclear to me is, what does the center expect to achieve with a new RE policy? So what is the policy going to prescribe more? So, and in fact, if we need to design a new policy, then we should be looking at the whole energy policy as a whole. So in fact, 3 years back, we had National Electricity Policy draft, and which is yet to be finalized. We haven't seen that. And if we are looking at transition to the new energy resources and transition to cleaner energy resources, then we should look at a range of technologies. And it's not simultaneously just not about the technology, it's also about the institutions and the political economy around it. So how do we sort of create a configuration of technologies, institutions, and politics around it? So that this draft bill sort of has missed out. And the second aspect about this technology specific RPO, so we already have a solar RPO, we have the overall RPO target. Now the proposal is to have a hydro RPO. So this is a little confusing for me in the sense because we have states with a varying range of resource base. So for example, a hydro-rich state, which is generating, I mean, there are several states which are generating 30–40% of their energy from hydro resources. Why should be they bound to a solar target? So while I agree that we should have a broader RPO or a non-fossil energy target, we should not be trying to push technology-specific RPOs. And yeah, and the new development around the clock solar is quite promising. I mean, this sort of changes the picture. Like few months back, we are talking about, can there be a replacement to coal as base load power? But the new RTC solar and the cost at which it has been discovered, it sort of provides a lot of hope. I mean, at this cost, probably India can even look at replacing coal in medium term to long term. But the challenge is, I mean, like in the same month when this price was discovered, which is levelized average tariff of 3 rupees 60 paisa per unit for 25 years. So Madhya Pradesh approved a power purchase agreement for 1320 megawatt thermal capacity at near about 4 rupee 80 paisa per unit. And Madhya Pradesh is a highly surplus state. And to the extent they spend 10% of their revenue requirement on back down capacity. So, I mean, the point is we need much more coordination around our energy policy and our resource targets, and which is clearly missing at the point. I'll stop. I think I answered your question, or did I miss anything?
Well, it's a very, very difficult area. And I'm glad you said it should not be looked at electricity, but in the larger energy scenario where RTOs are concerned. And would any of the other participants like to add a little bit more? I think we have another 2 minutes before I open it up for discussions, whether Ajay would like to add something, or would Ashok like to add something, or Mr. Girish Pradhan, anyone? No, not on the renewable sources of energy.
No, yeah.
They're always available.
No, madam, I wanted to add one thing, which is, see, electricity is a concurrent subject. Now, if you look at that unless and if you want to move forward in this direction, unless and until state come on the same page with the center, moving in this direction and making economically viable DISCOM seems to be just a night dream, or I don't know what you can call it. Now, if in the same fashion, I recently some people were talking and I had this idea. Now, let's look at our GST. Now, GST has been also a concurrent subject, and in concurrent subject, what happens is there is a council, and a council which consists of state and the center people, and all of them come together and decide the rate or the policy and things like that. Now, instead of Ministry of Power deciding that, if we have something like what we have it in a GST, a electricity council, where state and the center people come together, jointly decide on number of subjects and how to take it forward. Because GST has been a success, we can make electricity also as a success, not from a top-down or bottom-down approach, but a collaborative approach by taking the state which belong to different parties who have a different agenda, but they came together for GST. In the same fashion, if we can have an electricity council and then make changes, maybe it could be a win-win situation.
I think, Ashok, you're very right, because the basic problem that came up, and I had discussed this in Trivandrum also, the electricity, is the fact that the biggest amount of money that is asked by the Finance Commission is for the payment of the subsidy, right?
Yes.
Now, there is no provision in the Finance Commission or in any Electricity Act to allow for interstate discussions to take place and cooperations therein. You see?
Yes.
The point that you're making, which is very relevant, because the states themselves should be able to interact and work with it, and we have to strengthen the union of states.
Yes.
And perhaps that becomes more difficult in a centralized manner. Let us see how, because there are some.
As that Hindi dialogue, देख आगे आगे होता है क्या? देखते हैं आगे आगे होता है क्या? The famous our TV. Yeah.
I would now like to request the participants, because this is an open session now, and they will be of about, the time is now 15 till about 5:25 before I call upon Vipul to give his closing remarks. The question and answers, as you put it up, Uday will take it up, and it will be, please put whom you want to ask the question. That will be very important, and that will help. So use the time quickly and put up the questions.
Sure. Thank you, ma'am. Several questions have come, so I'll take it speaker by speaker. So the first question is from Mr. Girish Pradhan. What business model is suitable for bringing competition in electricity supply? Is it input-based, distribution franchisee, or full privatization, as in the case of Delhi or Bombay, or any other hybrid model? What could work for India? That's the question for Mr. Girish Pradhan.
Well, it's I think it's a very difficult prescription to give in terms of generalizing for a country as vast and as diverse and varied as India. So I suppose each state will have to look at their own resources, their own peculiarities, particular particular this thing is Mr. Jakar had just mentioned in terms of Punjab, Mr. Pense mentioned in terms of Maharashtra. We are a large country. But I would definitely say that a competitive model seems to be working. So, you know, the faster that you bring in competition, I don't mean unbridled competition in terms of no oversight, etc., but within regulatory purview, if you allowed competition to come in, things would be far better. Just one small thing, you know, about like Mr. Pense and Mr. Dixit here and Mr. Suresh Prabhu, I too belong to the great state of Maharashtra. Let me also, you know, give my 2 bits about the fact that MSEDCL or MSEB as it is called, was called, has a great tradition of consumer response. You know, you can't really paint the entire state DISCOM with one brush. At the same time, I would take issue with Mr. Jakar in terms of only the bureaucrats being responsible for the state of affairs. I myself have seen a circle, which is known as the Kolhapur circle, where the AT&C losses are 4.5%.
Oh.
Everybody takes a pride in that Kolhapur circle because the consumers also cooperate 100%. I mean, so you know, let's not just brush away the DISCOMs. They have some real major problems in terms of operational efficiency and running of operations. Thank you.
I think there was a very important and valid point you made, Mr. Pradhan. In the next discussion, we get someone from Tamil Nadu who have told me that the consumers are very willing to pay there. So we can compare the Maharashtra versus Tamil Nadu.
Thank you. The next question is for Shantanu. How do you think the Electricity Act 2003 helped the consumers so far? And what more can the current amendment bring for the consumers? Shantanu, over to you.
See, in terms of Electricity Act 2003 itself tried to put in place certain institutional structure and certain requirements in terms of ensuring consumer benefits, starting from simple requirements such as need to have standards of performance, you know, very clearly documented parameters and a mechanism to ensure that those standards are complied with, making regulators responsible for monitoring the standards of compliance. So institutional structure was put in place, which has definitely helped bring in more awareness, bring in more clarity about what kind of consumer service standards consumers should expect. But there needs to be greater emphasis on actually ensuring that these standards are complied with. The regulators need to be more proactive in holding distribution companies accountable for compliance with these standards. So that's something what we are looking at in terms of these amendments, that whether it can still give very clear and proactive mandate to regulators to hold distribution companies accountable on these issues. The other structure is, you know, a very welcome step that was there in the Electricity Act 2003 was allowing or in fact requiring regulatory commissions to appoint consumer representatives so that consumer representatives can actually bring forth consumers' issues before the regulator in all its proceedings. But unfortunately, we have seen that most state regulatory commissions have not appointed such consumer representatives, and few states which initially tried to put in good mechanism and ensure consumer participation have in recent years actually moved away from that. They are not appointing consumer representatives, they are not holding proper public hearings in the spirit of the act. So these are certain areas which, you know, actually the act and proposed amendments can try and strengthen in terms of consumer participation.
That's sad. That's very sad. That was very important, consumer participation. Yes.
I think the next question is for Mr. Ashok Pense. Do you think the Central Enforcement Authority and the direct benefit transfer scheme as suggested will lead to greater regulatory independence or not?
No, one basic part of it which will repeatedly come. Let us say, this contract authority, it does not have any any mandate as far as the tariff is concerned. And if you look at the basic dispute goes to the realm of, in the next part, is to some sort of tariff increase. Once again, from tariff increase, it is passed on to the consumer. So now, if the tariff is to be once again increased, whatever it is, for the old one, for the new one, etc., then it will have to go to a regulatory commission, because it does not have any loading as far as, they do not have the authority as per the. Let's look at our famous case, wherein which an energy watchdog case, and where it got said, change in the law, a new thing came in, change in the law. Now, as far as the change in the law is concerned, there are 11 parameters. Those 11 parameters, those 11 parameters, for everything, there is a tariff issue. Out of 11 parameters, 7 parameters have been decided so far. In the sense, it goes from regulatory commission to appellate to, in some cases, Supreme Court, and done. Still 4 are not decided. So even after Supreme Court, which is the final authority, like let's say dispute authority, even then after 4 years, out of the 11 parameters, only 7 parameters have been decided. 4 are not decided. Once again, once the parameter is said okay or not, then the calculation is done and the DISCOM is supposed to pay. That payment is still to come to them. So what they see in my, which is being repeatedly being said, this is something like a knee-jerk reaction to Andhra Pradesh. The crux of the issue is that ultimate man, the generator, is looking for money from DISCOM. Will he get that money? The answer seems to be, in my opinion, virtually no. Yeah.
Thank you,
Mr.
Prince.
Yeah.
The next question is for Ashwini Sen. How can the Act be strengthened to avoid the recent Madhya Pradesh high-cost thermal power purchase being tied up? There was a recent news where they tied up with the TPP at rupees 4.80 per unit, while other cheap RE options were available. Over to you, Ashwini.
Yes, so there's no OS center can control that. That's a state level decision that's ideally should have been taken between the DISCOM and the regulatory commission. But often, as we see, it's the state government which comes into play. In fact, this particular project was approved back in September last year in the state cabinet. So there's no OS center can fix this, but there are certain ways how you can check this. And that can be done through putting in some process in place. Like one process is ensuring that every project goes through an integrated resource planning. So that planning has not been happening. I mean, most of the time we add capacity based on, largely based on political aspirations. For example, this particular project in MP has been discussed for some time, but last summer the state had a range of power cuts in the state. So in response, there was a political mobilization around imminent power crisis, and in response, the chief minister said we'll add up some capacity, and that's how it's getting pushed. So had it been gone through proper planning, they would have probably realized there's no immediate need for power, and then if there is a future need, that can be met through cheaper RE and with the round-the-clock solar power. You can actually, which is modular, which can come up much faster. Thermal power needs near about 5-year gestation period, and this particular project has been granted some 54 months, while solar can come in within 2 years. So yeah, we need to put in process to check on this thing.
I think we are now at the last stage. You think we can take one more question?
Yes. So the last question, though there were 2 questions from Mr. Ajay V. Jakar, but he had to leave for some other meeting. But the last question is for Mr. Girish Pradhan, and I will also put that to Shantanu. in that order. What is the role of consumer and consumer responsibility? Currently, the proactiveness is only sought from the system. Is that fair? So I would request Mr. Pradhan and then Shantanu to intervene on this. Thank you.
Well, that's again a question which is like a minefield. I mean, we are all consumers. So I'm sure that just because you pay a high tariff or you pay industrial tariff or your manufacturer, you're not a consumer. So all these are in the basket of consumers. I think what Shantanu was trying to project was the lowest strata of consumers whose voice is never heard and whose concerns and whose needs are never articulated. The responsibility of a consumer is that of a good citizen. And to that extent, whatever we expect from a good citizen, we'd expect from a consumer, to the extent that his financial and economic situation is such that he or she can perform those duties as a citizen and as a consumer. So if he is weak, it's like the health sector. If you are ill, you can't be expected to play your role as a citizen unless you are nursed back to good health. And many of the consumers that Shantanu speaks for and stands for are in that category where they're dogged by ill health and need to be first nursed so that they can then perform their role as responsible citizens or consumers. Thank you.
Thank you. In fact, I would start from that with what Mr. Girish Pradhan said very aptly, that consumer's role starts from being that of a citizen. And when we look at it from that perspective, obviously consumers have to play multiple roles. They have to be more vigilant. They have to be a law-abiding citizen who pays their bills on time, who brings to the notice of the authorities all kind of wrongdoings that are happening around. So those are definitely very prominent and important roles for consumers. But at the same time, wearing the citizen's hat, also consumers need to be more vigilant in terms of contributing to ensuring that there is good governance in the sector. Raising pertinent questions about what was just discussed some time back in terms of what kind of power purchase agreements are required. What is the level of AT&C losses in the distribution utility? So those are the kind of some of the difficult questions that also consumers need to ask. Also importantly, consumers also need to be vocal in terms of supporting some of the good initiatives and the good performing distribution utilities or good performing officers and right kind of decisions, which again I find that at times consumers are not that vocal in supporting some of these good initiatives, whether it is in terms of solarization of agriculture, or there could be number of such examples I'm sure that all of us know from each state. So we also need to be more vocal in terms of supporting this kind of positive examples. So I think consumers have to play this entire spectrum of roles in order to ensure that ultimately consumers benefit from this improved services at a reasonable cost.
So now we come to the end of the discussion. It was an extremely interesting intellectual discussion, and I on my part would like to thank Uday and Guts for what they organized and got such an interesting group together. May I now request Vipul to give the vote of thanks and close the session.
Thank you, Dr. Gauri. Let me begin with by thanking all our panelists and our speakers for joining us today in this discussion. I will try to summarize this discussion in two parts. One is what I was expected to hear, but I didn't hear. Perhaps that is important, or they are important. and second is the content of today's discussion, and try to put it, rather put them in a simple language. I would begin with by saying that as per the United Nations guidelines for consumer protection, this is the basic.
You're not clear.
We have to,
you're not clear.
When we talk about the consumer,
Sir, your connection is
what I
creating a
say
problem.
is that as per the United First connection is consumer right, is right basic need. And so at this whole issue, a basic need for the welfare of consumers. Having said that, but I didn't hear that during this discussion. Perhaps there could be several reasons for that. I don't want to get into that. But having said that, do you think that we should consider electricity or consumption of electricity as a public good? Look at the all four criteria of determining public good. I don't think electricity is a public good. At the same time, we have to also underline universal access to consumption of electricity. And that is something, let me switch off my video, maybe that is better. That is something which I would like to underline. Now coming to my second part, I think the discussion was rich in content. We have made a note of them. At the same time, perhaps it is so rich that many things which have been said, they have gone above my head. So the point is, as a common consumer, what is it that I want? Timely delivery of quality service at a reasonable price. I'm not saying that without paying anything. Timely delivery of quality service at a reasonable price. And therefore, not as part of this Electricity Amendment Act or Amendment Bill, yet to become an act, but as part of national tariff policy, I think a number of good measures have been proposed. And of course, there is a possibility of further refining them. But we need to support that as consumer groups, because overall I think consumers are going to be benefited, common consumers are going to be benefited as a result of the implementation of those measures. Now here I would like to underline the word implementation. As we know, and Dr. Gauri, Mr. Pradhan, and all of us would know that implementation is a major concern in our country. We may have best of intention, but due to implementation concerns or lack of implementation, to be precise, unintended consequences of best of policies are also there. So we need to see how we can minimize them. So that's something which groups like us, we are working, including think tanks like Center for Policy Research, we are working on and will continue to work on. For example, this zero tolerance policy on gratuitous load shedding, I think that's a very good measure which is going to help us, particularly in a new normal where electricity is going to be much more important for accessing various services, not just to run a few lights or a few fans, but for accessing education service, for accessing health service. So how can we help common consumers to access those services in a better manner? That's something which we need to look at. The larger point which I would like, there are two in fact, with which I would like to conclude. First is that these are complex issues. I mean, many of them are complex issues. There are pros, there are cons. And we need to put them in simple language. So as we often do in case of bills like this, which are placed in the parliament, are going to be placed in the parliament, we come out with a document called Bill Blow Up, which is essentially putting things in simple language, what is there, what is not there, what are the good things, what are the not so good things, how can we make such a bill better, particularly keeping in mind the implementation issues. So that is something which we are going to do, number one. And many of the elements of that, the document which we are going to produce, were there in our presentation, and which unfortunately due to want of time, technical glitches, we couldn't make. One of my colleagues, Sarthak Shukla, he has to make that presentation, and sorry about that, Sarthak. And but we are going to send that presentation to all of you who have registered this webinar. So the larger point is that we have to come out with a document in simple language to tell our member of parliament and other stakeholders. So these are the issues, these are the concerns, these are the good things, these are not so good things, so that at the end of the day, we get a better legislation than what it is today, number one. I'll not go to get into the center, state, concurrent list and those kind of things. The only thing which I would like to say is that it is inexplicable to me that why one set of consumers in one part of the country, they are going to pay less than another set of consumers in another part of the country to pay more. The same kind of consumer, domestic consumers, pure household consumers like you and me. So that's something which you need to ensure that there is some minimum criteria so that Indian consumers as a whole can benefit as a result of these amendments. The second and final thing with which I would conclude is that is by posing a few questions. Is it necessary, or is it desirable, or is it possible to decouple electricity sector from political interference, given the political economy nature of this kind of a sector? Are there examples in India or in other parts of the world about decoupling of this sector from political interference? How do we do that or don't do that? What could be the possible benefits, possible challenges? So that's something which you need to ponder over a period of time as we make progress for consumers to be better benefited as a result of reforms in this sector. So therefore, I think there comes the importance of groups like us, press, cards, consumer voice, etc., various groups. And we need to, I think we need to network much more among ourselves to benefit from each other's knowledge, from various ground realities, as Dr. Gowri has rightly pointed out, that it would be very interesting to hear from consumers, let's say in Tamil Nadu, and compare them, or different types of consumers, and compare them with those in other states, let's say Punjab. And I would end by saying another thing, is that it's from another work which we are also doing. We have found that the cost of electricity for the industrial sector is particularly very, very high in India. And it is one of the factors which are impacting, I would say hugely impacting, the competitiveness of our industrial sector. And so for not just industrial sector, various other sector, agriculture and services as well. So how can we reduce the cost of production, transmission, as well as distribution of electricity? So I will leave with that question with you, and thanks to this new normal, I think in future we are going to have more and more interaction like this. So let me once again thank you, Dr. Gauri, our panelists and all participants, and over to Dr. Gauri and Uday for the concluding remarks or final remarks. Thank you.
Over to Uday.
No, I think with that, thank you very much. Thank you to Dr. Gauri for chairing the session. Thank you to Mr. Girish Pradhan, Shantanu Dikshit, Ashwini Sen, Ashok Pense, and Mr. Jakar, who's no more there with us right now on the call, on the webinar. With that, we close. As a part of the way forward, we will also be preparing our comments and suggestions on the amendment. And we'll also put that in public domain for comments and suggestions. And if there are like-minded institutions who would like to partner with CUTS in terms of submitting those comments, we'd be happy to collaborate in that exercise. With that, once again, thank you to all of you and have a good evening. Bye for now.